From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones.
I think this is the biggest single scandal in Britain today. It's been a scandal for so long, and I've never worked out why people weren't more angry about it.
Times columnist Fraser Nelson has been writing about the benefit system for years.
We think of ourselves as being a prosperous country, but we suffer from what Rabbi Lionel Blue, who was a big figure when I was growing up on Thought for the Day, he spoke about moral long-sightedness, the ability to see or get worked up about problems either thousands of miles away or 100 years in the future, while being blind to the scandals on our own doorstep. And I've always thought that welfare dysfunction and British poverty is one of those scandals.
A scandal in need of urgent attention, Fraser says. And he's travelled around the country, meeting some of those affected.
In central Birkenhead, there is neighbourhoods where 62% of the people are on out-of-work benefits, 62%. These are staggering figures, and nobody is discussing it. Now, one of the funny things about journalism is that I don't think if you're a journalist, you don't get to complain that nobody's talking about this. It's your job to try to tell the story better. And I've always wanted to try to do what I could, I guess, as a storyteller, to try to say that there's a fire burning in our society, and we need to, for the sake of those trapped inside it, we need to put it out.
So how did a system designed to support the most vulnerable end up so ineffective, so costly? Politicians agree something needs to be done, but not on what.
Our Pathways to Work Green Paper sets out decisive action to fix the broken benefits system, creating a more proactive, pro-work system for those who can work, and so we protect it for those who cannot work now and for the long term.
She needed to be tougher. She should be saying, no more hard-working taxpayers funding the family next door not to work.
Can the Secretary of State explain why disabled people are feeling so disregarded and scapegoated, and why impoverishing them to the tune of £5 billion is a higher priority than a simple wealth tax?
The story today, how the benefit system broke.
I'm Fraser Nelson, I'm a columnist at The Times.
Fraser, let's set the scene then. Which benefits and which bits of support are we talking about here, and how much does all of that currently cost?
Well, the overall problem, of course, isn't so much that it costs the taxpayer lots of money, though it does. The overall problem is that we've set two paths in society. For the wealthy, the more you put in, the more you get out. If you go to school, if you get good results, you go to university, then you'll be able to have a pretty good life, might even buy a house. But there's a whole new other strata of society who are given a very different set of incentives.
And in terms of what we have at the moment, what are the suite of benefits that we're talking about?
If you're on unemployment benefits, you'll be on about 12 grand a year. That really isn't much money by anybody's standards, one of the lowest amounts in Europe. But on top of that, you can add standard sickness benefits. That will take you up to about 17 grand. Now, that compares reasonably to the living wage. Full-time living wage is about 21 grand. 70% of incapacity benefit claimants also get PIP, which gives you help with various living costs.
Personal independence payments.
Yes. That will take you up to about 24 grand. So that's about 4 grand more than the living wage. Now, then for mothers, if you have a child, that will take you to 27 grand. And if a child is categorised as disabled, I met recently a woman in Keighley, a single mother with a disabled child. She told me she would need 35 grand in earnings to replicate what she's getting in benefits. Now, remember, the average UK salary is 30 grand. So there's no chance for her, who she's never worked before, of getting a job that pays anything like that, especially not in Keighley, where she's from. So you can see that the incentives could not be more perverse. If you're actually looking for a job, you face the threat of sanctions, for example. You're not paid much money. But if you manage to get categorised as being long-term sick, then the threat of sanctions is removed and you get given a lot more money. So our system is begging people to get themselves categorised as long-term sick in a system where about 70% of applications are approved. By the end of this Parliament, there's going to be £100 billion spent on the full associated costs of sickness benefit alone. And that's just a subsection of welfare. We've got 6 million people in this country on out-of-work benefits of one kind or another. That's 20% of Manchester, 25% of Liverpool. It's just a staggering waste. But this has been ignored because mass immigration lets you cover it up. But now, when immigration's off the table for political reasons, Keir Starmer is forced to confront what the Tories should have done, and that's the welfare crisis.
And the issue with that is that, correct me if I'm wrong, what we've seen the numbers in that system absolutely shoot up since after the pandemic. Is it the pandemic's doing which has really put a highlighter on this?
The pandemic is always blamed, but very deceptively so. When you look at the last sort of 25 years, you see that the sickness benefits were coming down in about 2002. So the Blair government was really focusing on disability benefits, and they wanted to really help people who'd had disabilities get into work. There were very welcome changes. We see disabled toilets, access issues. The very structure of workplaces were changed on the basis that having a disability should not mean that you're unemployed. And that was having an effect. So the number on sickness benefit was going down from 2.7 million to 2.2 million. That's where the low it hit in 2018-19. But then it started to surge. Now, by the way, this is 2 years before COVID.
Okay.
So it started to surge for a whole bunch of reasons, but perhaps number one was that mental health came along, and all of a sudden their system couldn't quite cope with this huge rise in people citing anxiety and depression, and then saying, by the way, because of his anxiety and depression, I'm not sure I could work. 70% of sickness benefit claims now are to do with mental health, not physical incapacity. And when this started happening, the system got out of control very quickly. So in the last 5 years alone, 1 million people have joined the ranks of a long-term sickness benefit claimants. 1 million people. That is just a staggering number. And worse, it's continuing apace. The current projections are that by the end of this Parliament is going to go up to something like 4 million. That's the equivalent of losing the working-age population of Birmingham, our second largest city, from the workplace, sucked by sickness benefit unless something radical changes. We are shoveling people at the rate of 2,000 a day onto a sickness benefit scrap heap, after which they're pretty much abandoned and never hear from anybody in officialdom again.
And is your argument that there is obviously a great portion of that number of people who need that help, can't work, need that financial support, but then there's, extra people who are chancing it or shouldn't be there or are trapped in that system? What accounts for that rise and how it might fall?
I wouldn't say chancing it, but certainly there are a whole bunch of people here, ranging from those with cancer diagnosis who genuinely can't work for various reasons. And then sliding down, you get people who basically are alcoholics. I met one recently who was showing up at a Citizens Advice Bureau saying, look, I needed 4 cans of beer before I came here to sign in my sickness benefit form. Obviously, I can't get a job.
Some days I don't get out of bed, some days I can't be arsed with the world. I'd rather go and get a can crack and get back in bed. And the only reason why I've come out today is because I had to come out to do this.
Now, he was given the sickness benefits claim. It went through. Probably he'll get the money.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
No, like I said, there's only you that I trust.
But when he walked out, I thought to myself, what's he going to do with that money? Is this really how we treat alcoholics in this country? We just give them a sickness benefit claim without any help, without any support? He needed help, but there's no prizes for guessing what he's going to do with the money when it comes through. And when I got home, I looked up the number of people who die for alcohol-related diseases. It has doubled in the last 10 years in Britain, doubled. So I'm not saying he is chancing it. I'm just saying he's not being given the support he obviously needs in that situation. And of course you will get people who will be exaggerating claims. But then again, if a system says to you, if you're anxious or depressed, we will give you more money than the living wage, then you can see a lot of people are anxious, genuinely depressed. They're not lying when they get given that assessment. This is simply the money which is on offer. And I don't think we should blame those taking up the offer. I think feelings of anger and resentment or accusations should all be levelled at the architects of the system and the ones who let it continue this way for so long.
and not just continue this way, but also trap some people in it. In some of your reporting, you had this incredible story of a gentleman who was trying to get off these benefits and couldn't.
Yeah, I mean, I did a film about this for Channel 4 a few months ago, and because I've been writing about this for so often and found myself relying on this sort of statistical soup, which doesn't seem to make much impact. And I just watched the Post Office and Mr. Bates film. I'm sure you've seen it too.
Yeah.
And that was funny because before that film came along, journalists had reported it, but it just didn't seem as vivid as television was able to make it. So sometimes when you listen through podcasts, when you watch on television, stories become real to you in a way that they aren't always on print. So I wanted to talk to some of the people here to try to say that we're not looking at terrible scroungers, we're looking at good people caught in a bad system. So I spoke to a whole bunch of people in various situations. As you say, one of them, Gavin, he's a taxi driver who works in the South Coast, and he had a heart attack.
I applied for long-term sickness benefits because I'd undergone open heart surgery. I had trouble getting to the toilet on my own, let alone working, you know. It was really tough, really tough.
He took a very long time to get on sickness benefit when he needed it. The help was very slow in coming, but then he got better and he called up DWP saying, look, I don't need the sickness benefit anymore. I think I'm able to come off it. Thank you very much for the support. He was told, no, you need to be reassessed. And he said, well, when's that going to be? Well, we can't tell you. We'll be in touch. And he kept calling them and calling them. Look, I don't need this. I don't need this money. Please stop sending me this money. But that was 3 years ago, and still nobody's contacted him. So he's still being forced to collect. Now, that's because, as I later found out, that they'd pretty much stopped reassessing people.
So these are people who were on benefits because they were long-term sick, and they were saying, actually, we're not going to touch base with you again.
Yeah, and when you're given one of these benefits, you're told, OK, we'll come back to you in 18 months, 2 years. It's not forever. We're supposed to get back in touch. But what they've done now is just not get back in touch. So the number of reassessments and people judged to work after reassessment has gone down by something like 95% over the last 5 or 6 years, because the government just has an unannounced policy of just giving up on those to whom they've written a sickness benefit check.
When you need this help at your lowest ill health and you're at your worst, you can't get it. You have to wait for it. And then when you don't need it, or you feel life's much better, they won't stop giving it to you.
Now, that is a terrible way to treat our fellow countrymen. It's a terrible damage to inflict on these communities, and it's just no way to run an economy. And the whole system needs to be torn up and redesigned.
So it's clear we've got a problem here in the UK, but I mean, is it not the case that other similar countries in Europe and the West are also suffering under the same confluence of factors?
Well, here's the strange thing. When you look at the rise of mental health complaints, this is something we're seeing across the Western world. The increase in prescriptions for ADHD, for Ritalin for kids, for antidepressants for adults. There's no country where that isn't rising. But when you look at the sickness benefit systems, you see a very different story. Like if you basically go from 2010, the UK disability has gone up by about 60%, the claimants.
60?
60s, which is a hell of a lot. Now, when you compare that to other countries, you can see Sweden has gone down by 50%. It's been cut in half. Australia down by 30%, Denmark down by 6%, and in Canada down by 11%. So a lot of developed countries have managed to reduce their sickness benefit caseload at a time where ours has absolutely surged. You can pretty much throw a dart at a map and hit a country who's doing it better than we are.
Fraser, we're talking about what is happening with the benefit system and why we have this enormous problem, it seems we do at the moment, and what might happen with that in the future. Can we completely rewind, though, to actually the very beginnings of the idea of the state being there as a support for people who are out of work or who are unwell? How did this actually come about? What was the premise, really?
Well, I guess all societies have had a mechanism of looking after those who are too sick to work. But I guess in Britain it would have started with 1911 with national insurance, and that we saw the beginnings of kind of social security. But we're mainly talking about people who are quite obviously too sick to work or were wounded in war. So you then get the 1945 settlement, where the Attlee government wanted to have a goal of full employment.
Tomorrow, there will come into operation the most comprehensive system of social security ever introduced into any country. We may be proud that Britain, which has given the lead in so many things to the world, is still in the forefront of social advance.
Now, in those days, there was no real conflation between being unemployed and being too sick to work. This was relatively recent that this came along. So previously, the sickness numbers were relatively steady. They didn't really start to kick off. Now, that kind of changed around the 1980s, where the Thatcher government thought to itself, OK, there's a whole bunch of guys in their mid-50s here who aren't having jobs in the factories anymore. Realistically, they're unlikely to find another job. So let's just effectively put them on sickness benefit and take the hit. They're going to be at pension age soon, and this will be a one-off adjustment. But it didn't end up being a one-off adjustment. It ended up growing and growing and growing. Now, when the Blair government came along in 97, they wanted to do big welfare reform because Bill Clinton had done the same in America with sort of tough love welfare reform. Blair saw this as a kind of new progressivism, that if you genuinely want to have a more cohesive society, you go in and you say to people who are unemployed, OK, we're going to make it a little bit tougher for you to stay unemployed if you can work, but we're going to make it easier for you and more rewarding to take a job. So a combination of carrot and stick. Blair tried to reform in the late 90s. You had this extraordinary situation where he had a huge majority, just like Keir Starmer does. He could push through anything he wanted through Parliament. But then he found that disabled protesters ended up chaining themselves to the gates of Downing Street, dousing themselves in fake blood.
Faced with the prospect of losing 40% of her care funding, Sue's come to Parliament with other disabled people who are also affected to try and lobby MPs.
I am nervous because the threat is that we might end up as prisoners in our own homes.
And it was a real shock to him that he was being accused of hitting the most vulnerable in society. And he had come into this welfare reform battle unarmed, basically. He hadn't really thought how he was going to explain it. His mission was being defined by his critics as taking away from the most needy, and he didn't have a good answer. So he pretty much abandoned proper welfare reform then.
And on the Conservative side of the ledger, of course, if we go back to 1992, the conference that they had that year, we had that famous speech by Peter Lilly.
I'm closing down the something-for-nothing society.
When you want to caricature a kind of cold-hearted Tory, you think of somebody who regards the sick and unemployed as being scroungers, as being low-life. And there's something else here which a lot of people don't realise, that when you go to focus groups, as so many politicians do, something that really gets them wound up are people claiming benefits they shouldn't. Now, if you are on the breadline yourself, if you're a low-waged worker, you are quite resentful at the idea of money being taken from your pay packet and given to the guy over the street who you think is swinging the lead. But when you look at the people you're talking about, their situations are always more complicated. But this emboldens politicians to use this kind of hard man language. And Peter Lilly did that in the 92 Tory conference.
I've got a little list of benefit offenders who I'll soon be rooting out, and who never would be missed. They never would be missed. There's those who make up bogus claims in half a dozen names, and councillors who draw the dole to run left-wing campaigns.
This was a Gilbert and Sullivan kind of pastiche. He was talking about, I've got a little list of benefit scroungers who will never be missed. And it tries a skit on the Mikado.
There's young ladies who get pregnant just to jump the housing queue, and dads who won't support the kids of the ladies they have kissed.
But at the time, this was, and it still stands, I think, the test of time as an example of kind of disgusting political populism. David Cameron and George Osborne even went there themselves. Again, they would use the language of swinging the lead, somebody whose curtains stay down while you're trying to get to work.
How can we justify giving flats to young people who have never worked when working people twice their age are still living with their parents because they can't afford their first home?
If you're a very rich man talking that way about people and benefits, it goes down badly. But worst of all, to those who genuinely want a more cohesive society, it sounds like you don't want that. It sounds like you just want to take money away from vulnerable people. The moment you do that, you lose the political argument, and after that point, it becomes difficult to do anything else at all.
That was their rhetoric. What did they actually do in the government?
Ian Duncan-Smith did a very good job, but he was aiming his at unemployed people. It wasn't really sickness benefit. So he managed to make work pay more. He managed to give people reassessments, help people back into work. And by the time lockdown came along, you had the proportion of British people in work at an all-time high. So now and again, when we hear it said, for example, that the Brits are work shy, that we're lazy, there's some people who never work, you need to remind yourself that only 5 years ago, we had the highest employment level in the history of these islands. And it was just knocked for six by COVID. But then they had the unexpected problem of mental health issues, which were, of course, compounded by lockdown very much. So right now, when you look at the number of young people not in education, employment or training, the so-called NEETs, it is now 1 in 6 young people falls into that category.
Which is incredible. 1 in 6 young people not in education, employment or training.
And a staggering number of these young people are claiming sickness benefit. So the amount of life that we're squandering here, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's bad enough for somebody in their mid-50s, but for people in their 20s to be on this, never to really get a foothold in the workplace. And the longer you spend there, the worse your chances are of ever getting properly onto the workplace.
So now we have had the Work and Pension Secretary, Liz Kendall, unveil her plans for how she wants to tackle this.
Mr. Speaker, this government is ambitious for our people and our country. And we believe that unleashing the talents of the British people is the key to our future success.
What exactly did she announce and what did you make of it?
She announced a green paper, which is her way of saying it's a review. And she's got a whole bunch of things that she's considering. I think there were 2 parts to her statement. One was her overall demeanour and her mission. I think she said exactly the right things.
We were elected on a mandate for change, to end the sticking plaster approach and tackle the root causes of problems in this country that have been ignored for too long.
I think she is somebody who really does grasp the seriousness of a situation and absolutely wants to tackle this head on. But the measures she announced were pretty weak. If you take, for example, the notorious work capability assessment, this is the kind of scheme which is writing off 2,000 people a day, the scheme which is responsible for directing so many people onto the rubbish heap rather than giving them the help that they need.
Where it stamps you as can work or can't work.
Exactly. Now, she says this is going to be abolished. Great, but the small print by 2028. So that's like 3 more years of this. And if you look at the amount of damage which the system is likely to do in those 3 years, I'm not sure it's early enough.
And your hope and her hope is that is replaced with what? Something that has more grades through it?
Something which treats people with modicum of respect, something which is closer to occupational health. At the moment, what happens is you go for a fit note to the GP, automatically gives you one in almost all cases, and then you get given a phone call, which can be about 30, 45 minutes, where the person on the other end of the phone is going through a tick box exercise, and quite often the claimant knows exactly what to say because you can find online what these questions are and what the right answers are. So this is no way to decide the rest of somebody's life. This is an absolute crime that is happening in this way, and yet it's going to stay for another 3 years. That's what I can't quite understand about this. I think she should be abolishing this next week. And it's my view that you actually can do this.
I guess the awful thing about this is that people might listen to you and maybe listen to Liz Kendall and completely agree with everything that you're saying about diagnosing the problem and how it gets sorted. But government being government and this being such an enormous task, there will be, even if unintended, people who end up not getting the support they need.
Oh, you bet.
People who desperately need that money to support their lives. And that is heartbreaking, isn't it?
Well, when you think of a number of assessments carried out every day, like 3,000, 3,500, statistically, if 1% of them are the wrong results, that is still a lot of people, dozens of people every single day who need help and are not getting it. Now, there is an appeals process, but there will always be people who will end up on the wrong side of what still is effectively a computer says no environment. I think there's no way you can come up with a perfect system. Government is too crude a tool. But you should ask, for those who are failed, what support is there? There's not nearly as many people there who could be helping people who are sick back into work. And that's what I think needs to change as well. For example, there are 7,000 people in government communications, an amazing figure. I would easily retrain 1,000 of them and put them into supporting people who are on sickness benefit or trying to claim, just to guide them through there. We need to treat people a lot more seriously and stop seeing them as the kind of roadkill of globalisation.
And not to end on a slightly frustrating note, but even if all of this were to go to plan and they were to get their £5 billion worth of savings by the end of this decade, we're not talking about cutting this enormous cost on government. It's slowing the growth, isn't it? And if you're worried about the money going into your school or defence or the court near you, there might not be a lot coming your way.
Even if I do manage $5 billion a year by the end of the Parliament, that is still a huge rise in the order of 20-30 billion pounds. And you might think, where's that money coming from? And the government doesn't have an answer. That's why I think that Liz Kendall's probably going to have to come back with something more ambitious. Unless, of course, there is more to her reform than she's letting on. It could well be that she is planning a whole bunch of reforms that she didn't meant to, because right now I can see how this helps, but I can't see how it changes the overall scandal, and I can't see how it comes even close to creating the kind of more socially cohesive economic model that you would think a Labour government was here to deliver.
Fraser Nelson, thank you.
Great pleasure.
Fraser Nelson, Times columnist. You can read his columns every Friday in The Times and at thetimes.com with a subscription. It is also there you will find all the latest twists in the fallout of the government's welfare reform proposals. That is it from us. Today's producers were Emily Webb and Olivia Case. The executive producer is Kate Ford. And sound design and theme composition were by Mauro Lassetto. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.